Good evening. It's Tuesday, the 29th of October. Our top stories. Condemnation from several of Israel's allies as its parliament bans the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency. Georgia's president calls for voters to take to the streets as she disputes the results of parliamentary elections. India and Pakistan choke through heavy smog, with fears Diwali celebrations could make it worse. And US police say they believe 3 ballot boxes' fires are linked, as officials stress their voting process is still safe and secure. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Girish Sawlani. Also tonight, new details emerge of Rodrigo Duterte's violent and deadly war on drugs in the Philippines. Well, several of Israel's allies have condemned a move by its parliament to ban the main UN relief agency from its soil. The US says it's deeply concerned over the laws, while the UK foreign minister has called the restrictions totally wrong. The chief of the United Nations says the move could have devastating consequences for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now facing starvation.
Generations of Palestinians have called this place home. 16,000 live in the Shafat refugee camp in East Jerusalem. A community built and supported by UNRWA for decades. It was already challenging for their staff, who provide services including healthcare and education, to come and work here every day. Israel's parliament now making it impossible, banning it operating in Israeli territory.
Anyone who acts like a terrorist has no right to exist in the state of Israel. UNRWA is not an aid agency for refugees, it is an aid agency for Hamas.
In January, Australia joined other nations in pausing funding to UNRWA after Israel claimed the agency had employees involved in the October 7 terrorist attacks. 9 staff were fired, but a UN investigation was unable to independently verify the intelligence used by Israel to make the allegations. Australian funding resumed in March, this ban opposed by the government. The foreign minister posting on social media, UNRWA does life-saving work. UNRWA is the biggest provider of aid in Gaza, support which has already been reduced to a trickle. The UN's top humanitarian official has warned that the entire population in the north is now at risk of dying. Israel's ban could make it impossible for UNRWA to operate there.
You won't be able to move in Gaza without being subject to possible attack. There'll be no visas for international staff, no work permits. Supply chains will fall apart.
You guarantee more children being killed. And I'm sorry for the lack of diplomacy in my language, but I think we've moved past the idea of sugarcoating this. We will simply see more little girls and boys in Gaza unnecessarily killed.
The legislation approved by the Knesset comes into force in 90 days, a time frame which has been designed to give Israel an opportunity to make new aid arrangements for the Palestinian population. Israel's parliament backing this proposal before that crucial detail had been sorted out.
UNRWA simply must be replaced. They must be replaced with other organisations that are not infected with terrorism.
There's nobody that can replace them right now in the middle of the crisis.
Added pressure from its strongest ally, Washington today reminding Israel of an earlier threat to cut US military aid if conditions in Gaza aren't addressed.
Passage of this legislation could have implications under US law and US policy. That remains the case.
Tough talk that's done little to sway an emboldened Israel.
A child has died and 4 others have been severely injured after a car ploughed into a primary school campus in Melbourne. Police say the vehicle veered off the road and crashed through a fence at Auburn South Primary School in Hawthorne East just after 2:30 this afternoon. 3 girls and 2 boys aged 10 and 11 were rushed to hospital, where an 11-year-old boy later died. The driver of the car, a 40-year-old woman who was picking up her child, has been arrested.
The 40-year-old female is in custody. She's been interviewed by detectives as we speak. It's a tragic circumstance. It's really tough for everybody involved, from the community, the school community, the locals, the first responders, AMBOs, police. It's really tough.
Thousands of protesters have gathered in the Georgian capital Tbilisi to demand the annulment of parliamentary elections on the weekend. They claim the vote was stolen, with the country's pro-Western president accusing Russia of interference. The governing Georgia Dream Party, which has become increasingly authoritarian and tilted towards Moscow, won an outright majority. It says the results was free and fair, but the election observers documented violations like ballot stuffing, bribery and voter intimidation. The US and the European Union have called for an independent investigation. The Pentagon says Washington will not impose new limits on Ukraine's use of American weapons if North Korea joins Russia's war. The Pentagon estimates 10,000 North Korean troops have been sent to eastern Russia for training. NATO says some units are already in the Kursk region of Russia near the border with Ukraine. The organization says Pyongyang's involvement in the war represents a significant escalation.
The deepening military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is a threat to both the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security.
Meanwhile, Russia has launched attacks on two of Ukraine's largest cities, killing at least 4 people. The deaths occurred in Kharkiv, where a rescue operation was underway to see if anyone was trapped under the rubble of one of the city's most celebrated landmarks. The UNESCO-protected Dezhprom building was also destroyed in the attack. In the capital, Kiev, 4 people were injured in drone attacks that set fire to a residential building. Local officials in the US say they believe fires at early voting drop-off boxes in 2 states are linked. 2 blazes broke out in Washington state and Oregon after another earlier this month.
Hundreds of votes up in smoke after this blaze at a ballot drop-off box ahead of the US election. This fire in the state of Washington ignited on the same night as another in Oregon, and police think they're connected.
No one was injured in any of these incidents. We're working with our partners across the river here in Portland.
Our officers quickly determined that there was an incendiary device that had been attached to the ballot box, and that is what ignited this fire.
A car has been linked to the other fire in Oregon, where only 3 votes were lost after a fire suppression system kicked into gear. Washington officials are now considering installing that failsafe used by its neighbour.
We use canisters that have a powdered fire suppressant, so it limits the damage to ballots. It worked exactly as it was supposed to and coated the entire inside of the box.
Officials are now working to maintain faith in the electoral system as early voters head to the polls around the country. Philadelphia, in the swing state of Pennsylvania, has had fewer requests for postal ballots than 2020.
We want everyone to feel comfortable with the process, that the process is going well, and that people actually use the system. Because these numbers that we're looking at, they're low.
Oregon officials echoing that sentiment after the spate of ballot blazes.
Our democracy depends on you, and you can depend on us to keep this process safe and secure.
Investigations are continuing into the incidents as Election Day gets closer. Lachlan Patrick, ABC News.
Let's return now to the Middle East, where Israel has passed a law barring the United Nations Relief Agency from operating in the country. Dr. Anne Irfan is a lecturer at University College London, and she joins me now. Really good to have you on the program with us. Now, as we've been reporting earlier, there's been global condemnation now from Israel's allies. So will Benjamin Netanyahu in any way be swayed by pleas from its closest allies not to implement this ban?
Well, it seems unlikely that pleas alone would be enough to sway him on this. We've already seen pleas regarding the provision of humanitarian aid in Gaza for over a year now, which have made little difference. From everything we know, it seems the only thing that would really have an impact would be actual action from particularly the US. And so far, there's no indication that the US is going to do that.
Do you believe Israel in any way has factored in its decision who would be providing aid in Gaza in the absence of UNRWA, with Antonio Guterres saying that there is simply no alternative?
Well, what's actually interesting is that in its actions in recent weeks, Israel itself has implicitly recognized that there is no alternative, because in recent weeks, Israel's become increasingly concerned about the outbreak of polio in Gaza. It's become concerned that soldiers may be contracting polio and transmitting it back to Israel. And because of this, it's been launching a vaccination campaign and using UNRWA to administer that vaccination campaign in UNRWA. So this is in Gaza. So this is an implicit acknowledgement on the part of the Israeli government that UNRWA is the backbone of humanitarian assistance and of essentially operations in the Gaza Strip. It obviously kept that quiet, but Israel itself, through its own actions, has signaled that there is simply no alternative. And certainly in the current situation we're seeing in Gaza, it is obviously not in any state to be creating new systems on the ground.
And how do you think people in Israel would be sort of responding to something that has just come out from their own government?
Well, we know that the Israeli public are hugely divided on the government. There were huge protests against Netanyahu. He also has obviously considerable support. All of the polling evidence we have suggests that many Israelis are opposed to UNRWA and support measures being taken against the agency. So the question remains of what all the alternative is on the agenda without UNRWA. It's also worth noting that there have been increasingly calls, including from figures within the Israeli government, to resettle Gaza, to return illegal Israeli settlements to the Gaza Strip. There was recently actually a conference featuring ministers looking at making this, how they could make this happen, and Netanyahu himself refrained from condemning it. So there are also questions over whether this is part of a bigger future plan.
And if Israel really does implement this ban, does it risk isolating itself from the international community, especially its allies?
There is a big question mark over that. Israel has increasingly been going to war with the United Nations recently. It prevented Guterres from even entering the Gaza Strip. Its ministers and the government have been openly condemning the UN in extremely vociferous terms. The UN itself, however, is relatively weak in its ability to actually take action. Ultimately, this will come down to the US, and a lot will be determined by the outcome of the election next week.
And of course, behind all the politics, of course, is this humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have already died. How bad, how much worse can the situation get?
It's horrific to think that the situation could get worse because it's so bad already. But unfortunately, any kind of, however meager level of assistance that currently exists will be taken out if UNRWA is not allowed to continue functioning. So it could be, a complete removal of even the most basic levels of aid there.
And is there something that I suppose the official government in the West Bank can do? And how much would this also be influencing how Hamas then reacts now?
Sorry, just to clarify, when you talk about the official government in the West Bank, what are you referring to?
Well, I'm referring to, of course, Mahmoud Abbas.
Okay, so it's worth keeping in mind that the official government de facto in the West Bank is Israel. Israel is the occupying power. The Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, under the terms of Oslo, has control over less than 40% of the West Bank. And in practice, we see even Israel moving into even those areas that are ostensibly meant to be under PA control. So there's little to nothing the PA can realistically do in this scenario. Mahmoud Abbas also has, very little legitimacy. His electoral mandate expired, more than a decade ago. He himself has not been able to go to Gaza for a very long time. It is essentially Israel as the de facto government of all of the land in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Now, UNRWA's chief says Israel is violating international law with this ban. What might be the consequences of this?
Well, the ICJ ruling earlier this year called on Israel to make sure it allowed all humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Obviously, this violates that ruling. We've also seen rising criticisms of Israel's conduct during the war, and under international law in general, any aggressor is obliged to protect civilians as far as possible, and this clearly violates that. In terms of consequences that we will see as this case continues to move through the international courts, whether there is going to be action taken. And again, unfortunately, international law is also connected to politics, and it will depend to some degree on whether powerful actors on the world stage signal that they are willing to take action over this.
And all this is, of course, happening, just a day after Egypt, made this proposal for a truce, a ceasefire with a prisoner exchange between Gaza and Israel. Does this sort of blow this opportunity apart?
Well, there have unfortunately been, repeated truce options, ceasefire options put on the table, none of which have had much effect. There is quite a strong body of evidence now that Netanyahu is actually is not interested in a truce or a ceasefire, largely for internal political reasons, because all of the evidence we have shows that the vast majority of Israelis think Netanyahu should stand down as soon as the war is over. He has a vested interest in continuing the war. But in terms of what this does for the situation on the ground, if it's going to throw Gaza into an even, if we can believe it, even worse humanitarian catastrophe, that does very little to suggest prospects of peace. And if the Israeli government is prioritizing the well-being and the safety and the lives of the hostages, which is what its citizens are calling on the government to do, then it should be doing everything in its power to prevent worsening conditions in Gaza.
And given that UNRWA also works around the region in Syria, in Lebanon as well, and given Israel's operations in parts of Lebanon, how would this at all impact UNRWA's work in those countries?
This is a really great question that remains to be seen to some degree. As you say, UNRWA operates in Jordan, Syria and Lebanon as well. Its work in Lebanon is particularly critical and has been particularly critical in recent years, given the rising disorder and the political and economic crisis in the country. The main question there is obviously Israel is currently also at war in Lebanon and its forces are on the ground in parts of the country. So there's a question over whether Israel is going to resume its occupation of Lebanon. It obviously previously occupied the south of the country from 1982 until 2000. And if it does, is it going to allow UNRWA to operate in the areas that it's occupying and controlling in Lebanon as well?
Okay, Dr. Anne Irfan, really good to get your analysis on this topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The United Nations says more than 25 million people in Sudan are in need of humanitarian assistance. The UN described the situation for civilians in Sudan as a nightmare of violence due to the ongoing civil war, which has raged for more than a year and a half. Residents from 30 villages have fled to neighboring states to escape the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, who have been accused of shooting civilians and sexually attacking women and girls. Nearly 11 million of citizens have been displaced, and the country is on the brink of a full-blown famine.
I am horrified by the Rapid Support Forces' continued attacks against civilians in Al-Fashar and surrounding areas, which include displacement sites where famine conditions have been confirmed. And I'm also horrified by reports of attacks against civilians perpetrated by forces affiliated with the Sudanese armed forces in Khartoum, and by continued mass civilian casualties due to apparently indiscriminate airstrikes in populated areas.
Air quality in India and Pakistan has worsened in the past few days, with intense smog enveloping cities. The situation has forced changes to school times, and people have been warned to stay indoors in a bid to protect public health.
Hazy scenes in Delhi and Mumbai as pollution levels surpass safe limits this week. Locals reported health problems as a thick smog arrived in India, affecting millions of residents and prompting officials to spray water on roads to combat air pollution.
There is so much pollution in Delhi that we cannot even breathe properly. I've been ill for 4 days due to pollution. There's breathlessness and continuous coughing.
The smog is also crippling neighbouring Pakistan's Punjab province, with school hours changed to reduce health risks to children. The province's capital, Lahore, topped the global pollution charts on Monday with air quality categorised as hazardous.
In the morning, the smog is more intense. Keeping this in mind, the government has wisely taken measures to prioritise children's health by rescheduling school timings when the smog's intensity is reduced. This is a good initiative by the government to provide safer facilities for children.
The change in school hours hasn't reduced the smog. It remains a constant issue. The revised timing has only caused disturbance in public schedules.
India and Pakistan battle air pollution each year between October and January, as industrial emissions, crop burning and low wind speed create ideal conditions for smog. It comes as the UN's weather agency says carbon dioxide concentrations have hit a new high over the past year, and that burning coal, oil and gas are the main culprits.
Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere faster than at any time experienced during human existence. And because of the extremely long lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere, we are committed to rising temperatures for many, many years to come.
With India's festival of Diwali kicking off this week, there are concerns fireworks may worsen the air pollution. And with revised school times in place in Pakistan until January 2025, locals are bracing for an intense smog season. Amelia Costigan, ABC News.
Volkswagen is negotiating with workers over plans to shut at least 3 factories in Germany and lay off thousands of staff. Workers at Europe's biggest car maker are preparing for a second round of collective bargaining as they brace for major job losses. Tens of thousands of jobs are on the line as part of proposed cost-cutting measures. With more bargaining talks scheduled for Wednesday, the union says they will push for a better deal. An independent inquiry has found Australia's COVID-19 response eroded public trust so deeply people might not accept restrictions like lockdowns during any future crisis. The inquiry hailed courageous decisions taken by leaders at the outset of the pandemic, but said cracks started to emerge as the crisis wore on. Here's political reporter Stephanie Delzell.
Silent cities, shops shuttered, and hospitals overwhelmed. Generations changed by a once-in-a-century pandemic.
The striking conclusion, I think, from this report, though, is that right now we are arguably worse placed as a country to deal with a pandemic than we were in early 2020.
The report finding Australia's response to the pandemic drove a large decline in public trust.
Many of the measures taken during COVID-19 are unlikely to be accepted by the population again.
Delays in the vaccine rollout, prolonged restrictive public health measures and ultimately cost $31 billion. And the report said some of those measures, like school closures and lockdowns, must be used carefully.
Because of the strength of the public health response, a lot of people felt, they didn't trust what government was doing.
Heavy-handed restrictions also amounted to a lack of compassion, according to the inquiry. That's something acutely felt by Richard Smith, whose wife was in an aged care home. His family was unable to see her for months.
The distress was not only felt by the residents, but by the family to see the distress that their loved ones were going through.
But despite all the issues, the report stressed Australia fared well compared to other nations.
We saved lives and we saved livelihoods, and I think Australians should be proud.
One of the recommendations has already been acted on, funding a Centre for Disease Control.
An opportunity to lay a foundation for Australia's future pandemic preparedness.
The toughest decisions on lockdowns, school and border closures and vaccine mandates were made by the states and territories and weren't directly covered by this inquiry. But even so, it was highly critical of poorly justified and disproportionate approaches to restrictions across the country. With goodwill deeply eroded, the report plants serious doubt about whether a less trusting public would even follow better targeted rules in the case of another pandemic. Stephanie Dalzell, ABC News, Canberra.
Police and demonstrators have clashed in Peru amid protests against rising crime. Thousands of people blocked a highway in the country's north on Monday to protest the government's failure to protect workers from extortion. Protesters from the agricultural industry set fire to a truck and riot police responded with force. The protest left at least 3 civilians wounded and 2 policemen beaten, according to local authorities. China says it's ready to launch the next crew to its orbiting space station this week. 3 astronauts will be sent to space on Wednesday in China's 14th crewed mission. The group includes China's only female space flight engineer, making her the third Chinese woman sent to space. The group will spend 6 months on China's space station, undertaking scientific research. The former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte says he maintained a death squad of gangsters to kill other criminals when he was the mayor of Davao City before winning the 2016 presidential election on his anti-drug campaign. Now he's fronted an inquiry in the Senate into that campaign. The government says more than 6,000 people were killed in police operations during Mr. Duterte's war on drugs. And for more, I'm joined by the Philippines by political analyst Richard Haydarian. Richard, really good to have you on the program today. And we are trying to get Richard online, and here he is. Richard, good to have you on the program from the Philippines. Now, it's quite the admission from Rodrigo Duterte during his time as mayor, death squad to kill criminals. How did that go down?
Well, it was a very controversial hearing because the very nature of that hearing was under question, because after all, as the senators who more or less orchestrated, some would say, the hearing were very sympathetic, if not deferential, to the president. In fact, one of the senators who was overseeing the hearing, Senator Bato de la Rosa, used to be the former police chief when Rodrigo Duterte had launched this bloody drug war. So you have a couple of senators there who are allied to Duterte or have their own skin in the game. And that's why the nature of the Senate hearing from the very beginning was very much controversial. Nevertheless, I think precisely because Duterte felt comfortable, essentially around, surrounded by a cheering squad, at times he felt like he was the president. At times he was back into the mold and all the chutzpah and braggadocio. And along those lines, he in fact almost admitted that he instructed his police officers to set up criminals to have themselves gunned down. So essentially, he revealed the modus operandi. But just like any demagogue or populist, he would speak from four sides of his mouth. So a second later, he would contradict himself and question anything to contrary. So it was very much Duterte's show. But nevertheless, precisely because it was his show, he also ended up making some self-incriminating comments.
Yeah, so if he makes those self-incriminating comments, wouldn't this not trigger some sort of an alert with the Philippines police to say maybe we should be investigating this?
Interesting. So one of the reasons it was controversial is because Duterte used that as a platform to reach out to the Philippine police and say, hey, I'm on your side. I'm protecting you guys. You put your lives on the line for my war on drugs. We are in this together. In short, he's telling them not to turn against him. He's telling them not to go along with reforms in the police institutions and not to be open to any kind of prosecution and investigation. So he used it as a rallying cry. Nevertheless, if the Philippines were a slightly more functioning democracy, I would say at this point in time, I think there was enough incriminating evidence for the Department of Justice to move ahead. Nevertheless, many are taking notice. One is the International Criminal Court, which is investigating the mass atrocities under Duterte. Obviously, there are also people in other branches of the state, particularly in the Philippine Congress, because this was in the Senate, who are keen on making a much more forceful hearing and investigation into Duterte's alleged crimes against humanity when he was the president of the Philippines. So for me, it was a controversial hearing. Nevertheless, there was enough self-incriminating commentaries and enough pushback by the only progressive opposition senator there, Riza Hontiveros, who also confronted the president and told him, what you're saying is wrong. It's against the law and against the Constitution. So I think that provides enough material for succeeding chapters, particularly if the ICC, Department of Justice, or the lower house of the Philippine Congress step in for real investigation of what happened.
Yeah, I suppose then the Justice Department has a lot to answer for in terms of what the president had done during his time in power. Do you see anything that the Justice Department might do, especially coming from the Philippines first?
Well, the Philippine Justice Department has become a little bit more critical of Duterte's legacy and the Dutertes in general over the past 2 years. As you know, this hearing took place against the backdrop of a complete disintegration of a kind of a unity, an alliance, some would say cartel, between the Marcoses, the notorious Marcoses, and the Dutertes. The current president of the Philippines is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So against that backdrop of political fallout, the Philippine Department of Justice has sounded more amenable to cooperation with the International Criminal Court, while the Congress, which is under the leadership of a cousin of President Marcos, Mr. Romualdez, has also shown more teeth and willingness to go after Duterte's. So you see this kind of multiverse whereby a certain section of the Philippine society treat Duterte as if he's still the president of the republic, and above the fray and almost with impunity, while there are other sections of the state and the political class which is thinking this is a time to bring down the Dutertes. After all, you have the president with all the chutzpah and braggadocio making all of these self-incriminating commentaries during this so-called hearing.
Yes, Richard, this is a very confusing multiverse when it comes to the Marcoses and the Dutertes. Do you see the vice president, Sarah Duterte, Rodrigo's daughter, having a say in any of this at all?
Well, perhaps one reason there's some sense of caution among certain quarters of the Philippine elite is because the vice president is a breath away, right? Is a heartbeat away from the presidency. I mean, God forbid if something happens to the Filipino president, immediately there's going to be a shift in power. Nevertheless, as we speak, it's not only the father, former President Rodrigo Duterte, but practically the entire Duterte dynasty, which is facing a pushback because Sara Duterte herself is facing potential investigation for alleged abuse of discretionary funds, among other things. And she could also face impeachment down the road. So that's why the Dutertes wanted to use this so-called hearing as a platform to rally their base and to say we're still a force to reckon with. So it was much more political than legal. But I think if the legal and judicial institutions took notice, there's enough material out there for them to make necessary moves. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not by the end of this year, but sometime next year, including the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, you spoke earlier about the International Criminal Court investigations. Can you give us an update of where that is at the moment?
Well, I mean, the expectation was before the end of this year, the International Criminal Court will push for either issuance of a blue notice or red notice by the Interpol. So blue notice means that the Philippine law enforcement authorities have to cooperate with the international police, Interpol, to provide additional information to shed light on the nature of the war on drugs and mass atrocities during Duterte. A red notice would mean essentially issuance of warrants of arrest, similar to what ICC pushed against, let's say, Vladimir Putin of Russia. At this point in time, it looks like, from my understanding, because I was at The Hague earlier this year, and I kind of confirmed that there's some communication happening between the International Criminal Court and the Philippine government. It looks like there's still some negotiation going on. I think Marcos Jr., the Filipino president, wants to split the difference, meaning he will try to project this image. No, we're taking care of our business. You don't have to come in, at least not yet. Let us do this investigation. Let us soften the ground. Maybe later on, I'll be open to you guys stepping in. So it's very possible that behind the scenes, there's a lot of these negotiations and coordination between the International Criminal Court and the Marcos Jr. government. And Marcos Jr. is also using this as a Damocles sword as the Philippines heads into a midterm elections in the coming months. So that upcoming elections is also adding complexity, because if you're Marcos Jr. on one hand, you have all the levers of power to bring down Duterte's, but you also do not want to make them look like victims, right? Because they'll use that in order to mobilize their base in the upcoming elections that could be very much existential for that notorious dynasty.
Yeah, cue the political maneuvering. Richard, you are, of course, there in Manila. Can you give us a sense of the ongoing fallout from Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs, with the estimates that, at least more than 20,000 people were killed, according to rights groups?
Yeah, it's something very, very tragic. And in fact, we're at the point where we're debating, was that just populism or perhaps a form of fascism? Because you had an open celebration, if not worship, of violent acts. And the tragedy of this is that the ones who were affected, arguably 99.9% of those who were affected, were the poorest of poor Filipinos who don't, have these platforms, who don't have the facility of language, who don't have the voice. And they come from poorest communities, which were not given the kind of voice to really get sympathy, if not judicial intervention. So it's the underprivileged communities who were hit the worst. That's why it's hard to get a sense of how bad the drug war fallout is if you talk to the middle classes or the upper classes in the Philippines, because a lot of them would say, well, we didn't say any extrajudicial community killings in our communities, or they were unscathed. But I think if you really go to the ground to the poorest and poorer communities in Manila, there are a lot of traumatized families. More than 150 children apparently were also killed in this operation. So not only drug suspects, but also family members and minors were killed. And we're also talking about potentially the things that Duterte did when he was mayor of Davao City, another major city in the Philippines in the past. So to be honest, we're still coming to terms with the shock, with the moral shock and the humanitarian catastrophe that the Duterte drug war meant. And I think a lot of my fellow Filipinos are still trying to come to terms with that. And that's why I think there's still a lot of discomfort, if not denialism, with respect to how tragic that was. So it's ironic. I go abroad and everyone tell you, my goodness, what's happening in your country? Tens of thousands have been killed. I come back to Philippines and talk to people, and people, a lot of them try to dismiss it, downplay it, or they're having a hard time emotionally to say, oh my goodness, I didn't speak out all those 6 years when tens of thousands of my countrymen were being essentially massacred based on the reports we're seeing. So there were very few of us who bothered to speak out. And for a while, I was almost self-exiled there in Australia, among other places, because it was very dangerous to speak out against it before. So the one major change I see now compared to back then is that, ironically, under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., as odious as that name may sound for democracy, there's much more democratic space and a sense of freedom for a lot of independent voices to finally put some scrutiny on the horrible legacy of former President Duterte.
Okay, hopefully we'll hear more on that front as this inquiry continues. Okay, Richard Heydarian, really good to get your thoughts on this. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
You're watching The World. The top stories we are following tonight. Israel's allies expressed their concern over legislation banning the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency from its soil. Thousands of protesters gather in the Georgian capital Tbilisi to demand the annulment of parliamentary elections, questioning the outcome. And people are warned to stay inside as air quality worsens in India and Pakistan. Let's return to the US, where Democrats have stepped up their attacks on Donald Trump after a comedian opening a rally for the former president called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. In a rare move, the Trump campaign has distanced itself from the remarks, and with just over a week to go before Election Day, the fallout underscores the importance of the Latino vote in the crucial swing state of Pennsylvania. North America correspondent Jade McMillan reports from Erie, Pennsylvania.
Just a few months ago, Joe Biden was a candidate in this election. Instead, the president lined up in his home state of Delaware to cast an early ballot for his deputy.
And this is your ballot. You can step right on the floor.
Joe Biden also using the opportunity to weigh in on a scandal on the other side of politics.
Just simply embarrassing. It's beneath any president.
Donald Trump's campaign has tried to distance itself from a comedian's remarks at the former president's recent Madison Square Garden rally.
But there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah, I think it's called Puerto Rico.
A spokeswoman for Mr. Trump said the comment didn't reflect his views about the US territory, while his running mate tried to play the whole thing down.
I'm not going to comment on the specifics of the joke, but I think that we have to stop getting so offended at every little thing in the United States of America.
People living in Puerto Rico aren't allowed to vote in presidential elections. But in the critical state of Pennsylvania, more than 50% of eligible Latino residents are of Puerto Rican descent.
He said a lot of things about Latinos coming from South America through the border. So, it's just, it's people, I guess, are used to, his behavior.
Kamala Harris's campaign has seized on the opening.
They want a president of the United States who's about uplifting the people and not berating, not calling America a garbage can.
With just over a week until Election Day, both candidates are spending most of their time and money in the 7 states where the race is considered to be competitive. Today it was Georgia and Michigan, but they'll be in Pennsylvania later this week, and it could be the biggest prize.
Erie County in the state's northwest has picked the winner at every presidential election since 2008.
And he did nothing for us, so we have to give her the opportunity to show us.
I just don't like his delivery system sometimes. He's very brash, and that's fine. That is who Donald Trump is.
A battleground within a battleground that could prove decisive. Jade McMillan, ABC News, Erie, Pennsylvania.
The Bolivian government has denied accusations it led a targeted attack on former President Evo Morales. Morales claimed the government attempted to assassinate him when his car was shot at on Sunday. But a government spokesperson has since said it was Mr. Morales' convoy that fired on police first, while they were carrying out a standard highway patrol. He says the police returned fire. The government says the convoy ran over an officer and that they suspected the vehicles of transporting drugs. The accusations come amid heightened tensions between Mr. Morales and his former ally, the current president, Luis Arce. Well, new data shows global efforts to tackle climate change are wildly off track, and warming gases are accumulating faster than at any time in human existence. Researchers are also worried that forests are losing their ability to soak up carbon, with more than a third of tree species facing extinction.
Trees are vital to help clean the air we breathe, soak up carbon emissions and provide a home for thousands of different birds, mammals and insects. Yet it's been revealed that more than a third of trees around the world are in trouble. Experts here at Kew worked on the latest Extinction Red List, which found deforestation is a major threat to life on Earth.
38% of the world's trees are threatened with extinction, more than all the threatened mammals, birds, amphibians and reptiles added together. So a huge number of species, and these are found all across the world. In 192 countries there is a threatened tree species. So yeah, there's work to do everywhere.
The Extinction List is an ever-growing tally of living things facing extinction, with more than 16,000 tree species at risk, like this Woollamie pine. And if you take away the trees, you lose habitat for other living things, from birds to mammals.
And it's not just trees joining the unenviable list. Animals and birds are highlighted too, such as the much-loved hedgehog, whose fortunes are going from bad to worse as wild spaces disappear.
Now that swelling on the branch is what kills the branch, and that's what causes the tree to die eventually.
With time running out, scientists are trying to find solutions. And here at Kew, this living library of trees is helping with conservation in the wild.
By using the Extinction List, it does allow us to really focus on vulnerable species. We could then go and collect those species and try to grow them on in the Arboretum to safeguard them, with the aim to then reintroduce them. And that's how we can really make a significant difference in protecting forests for the future.
And as autumn sets in for these trees, it's hoped this new list can help focus conservation efforts where it's most needed and safeguard future forests.
A criminal court in Paris has postponed the sexual assault trial of prominent French actor Gérard Depardieu due to concerns about his health. Mr. Depardieu is facing charges of sexually assaulting 2 women on a film set. With more, I'm joined by Catherine Porter, international correspondent for the New York Times. Catherine, really good to have you on the program with us. Firstly, can you give us a sense of how big this trial is in France and indeed in Europe, given what we've seen in the US with the likes of Harvey Weinstein and Sean P. Diddy Combs?
It's huge in France. Since the Weinstein case launched the Me Too movement around the world, it's been stalled in France, and this would be the first case of a megastar, a very big star, facing actual trial. So there was a lot of people there yesterday. There were protesters. The courtroom was packed. They had an overflow room also, packed with journalists, but also with supporters of the women and other actresses who have accused Mr. Depardieu of sexual harassment, assault, and rape. And there was a lot of disappointment that it's been delayed for 6 months.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that delay, well, will that have any sort of impact on the actual legal proceedings?
It really depends. I mean, everyone's hoping he shows up. His lawyers produced 2 medical documents from 2 different doctors saying that he was unable to stand trial. He's had diabetes for 25 years. The man is 75 years old. And he's no longer managing it well. He has heart problems. There was just a huge list of problems, them saying that he needs to prove that he's healthy enough to stand trial. They have decided to, instead of just having the trial on 1 day, to make it 2 days so he can come. And everyone, including the defendants, are really hoping that he will show up. So we'll see what happens over the next 6 months.
And Catherine, what can you tell us about the weight of evidence that is stacked up against Gerard Depardieu?
Well, this is one of many. This is one case of many that have been filed before police. It's the first one to come to trial, which is why it's such a big deal. In the front row of the courtroom was a young woman, a young actress who has charged him with rape and not just sexual assault. Her case is still pending. We're waiting to hear when that will hit trial, but the prosecutors have asked for it to go to criminal trial. In this case, he has two women that were working on the set of one of his latest films called The Green Shutters, Les Volets Verts, that say that he grabbed them, touched them, tried to pin one of them down, grabbed her breasts, her buttocks, and made very lewd comments. The case says that she has 3 witnesses of this. And then the other is a young assistant director who, on the walk to the set each day, say that 3 times he grabbed her inappropriately. You know, there's enough evidence that it was very swift. It's come to court. Usually these cases take a long time. It's just months after they complained to police that we're in court. It's the first time. So, you know, there's obviously enough evidence or witnesses to this to bring it to court. But it's by no means the most serious charges that he faces.
And what do you think will be the focus of the actor's defense team?
Oh, we had a little amuse-bouche of it yesterday. He said that these women have pseudo-allegations, that they've made it all up, that the police investigation was corrupt itself, that they ignored a huge number of witnesses that were in the room that said nothing happened. He said that the women are out for money. Interestingly, they've only, according to him, are looking for 6,000 to 30,000 euros for compensation for work time off work. This is not a huge amount of money by any stretch. You know, even at the top, 30,000 euros. It seemed like a pretty weak argument to me, but it's a classic argument that, you know, it's a false claim. They're out for fame, they're out for money. And he has long said of all the accusations against him that he is innocent, that people are after him because of his fame, and that he is someone who tests the boundaries of vulgarity, who likes to play the buffoon, but he's never touched someone or meant any harm to anybody, and he's definitely never raped anybody. So this will be the first time that he will be tested in court, that it's not just a war of words in media. And I think that's really important to a lot of people. They're waiting for this case to go ahead to see if the Me Too movement in France goes past the media sphere.
And on that presumption of innocence, we had the French President Emmanuel Macron saying that this was a manhunt targeting a towering actor. Those were his words, who makes France proud. What do you make of what the president had to say there?
Yeah, that was quite shocking to a lot of people. Now, to put that in context, he was speaking about a documentary that came out, was aired last December, in which the documentary maker got footage of film when Mr. Depardieu was in North Korea visiting, and he was captured making very vulgar comments to his translator, but also to a really young prepubescent girl who was going by on a horse. He was watching her ride a horse and was making very vulgar comments about her. And there was a huge reaction in France that people thought like it was almost a window onto evidence of some of the vulgarity that he's been accused of. And there was a huge reaction in the country, particularly around his words of this little girl. So Macron came out and defended him within that context. Whether he would do that now, this many months later, I'm not sure, but it just shows in a way what a towering figure Depardieu is, and also how the debate around Me Too in France has not necessarily moved that much. There's a real sense that that's this import from the United States with its puritanical mores, and that France should be set apart, that is a country where, you know, of romance, of dragging women is part of the culture, and particularly around film. There is this real status of a director and filmmakers here, as artists that are idolized and part of the fabric of the culture and what makes France France. And I think we could analyze his remarks with that lens, that he's coming to bat for an essential part of French culture. Again, there was big backlash, and many of the signs yesterday that were held up at protest were saying, no, he does not make France proud, echoing Macron's very words.
And just briefly on the Me Too movement, of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of this mass rape trial of Dominique Pellicot and the horrific things he's been accused of doing to his now ex-wife Giselle Pellicot. How does that feed into that, the Me Too movement in France?
I mean, definitely there is a lot of talk right now about rape, about sexual assault, about consent. So we really, there's not really a day that goes by that the newspapers aren't reporting on the Pellicot trial. And so it comes at a really different time of the national discussion around these issues. Depardieu is not the first, he's the first big star to be tried, but there are other cases that are coming up within the next months. So I think that there's kind of a drumbeat. It's been very interesting to be here and cover the trial of Mr. Pellicot and 50 other men, to see the discussion in the country and how it's changing, how more and more men are coming out and talking about changes that need to be made within the culture, discussions about change to education that need to be made, structural changes. I feel it's been really interesting because you can sense the ground shifting. And this trial in the south of France is going on. It's only halfway through. We're only partway through. So I think it's had an enormous impact on and opened people's eyes to what we're hearing more and more in the French press as rape culture in France.
Okay, we'll see what happens when the trial hopefully resumes in March. Catherine Porter in Paris, thanks very much.
Very welcome.
A spectacular goal from Kyra Cooney Cross has helped the Matildas upset Germany 2-1 in Duisburg. The world number 4 Germany took an early lead in the friendly international. Australia answered with a long-range strike from Cooney Cross in the 39th minute. It was her first goal for the Matildas. Claire Hunt also scored for her maiden international goal as the Matildas beat Germany for the first time in 19 years.
I couldn't stop thinking about it after I scored. It just feels a big relief. I think we've all been waiting for this moment for a long time, and it's finally happened, and especially on my 50th game, so it's even more special.
And there's been a Spanish double at the Ballon d'Or Awards in Paris. Manchester City midfielder Rodri took out the male footballer of the year ahead of Brazilian Vinicius Jr. Barcelona's Aitana Bonmati won the women's Ballon d'Or for the second year in a row. And for years, the Adelaide United women's team has struggled to leave a mark on the A-League competition, with its best finish being an elimination final loss a couple of seasons ago. After a poor season last year, the club has brought back a dynamic duo along with 3 internationals in a bid to turn its fortunes around.
A team yet to feel success after 16 years in the league. A wooden spoon last year, leaving them hungrier to turn it around this season.
It wasn't our best season, but the good thing is we know how to bounce back. We're professionals and we know what to do. And I think because it was not our favourite season, we want to try and prove ourselves and prove to the league that we're a finals contending team.
The Adelaide United's women's team have had a poor record since the Women's A-League began in 2008. It's the only inaugural club without a grand final berth.
We feel like we can be really competitive and win more matches this year and hopefully push us higher up the table.
Last season, a lack of consistency was to blame, along with issues on both ends of the pitch.
We've got a lot to prove. We know that we're better than what we showed last season, and so we are very hungry to turn it around and make sure that we have a really positive year this year.
A positive pre-season coupled with the return of the danger duo in Fiona Wirtz and Chelsea Dorber has the players hopeful they can be the team's saviour for its attacking woes. The last time the two played together for the Reds, they kicked 23 goals collectively in a season where the team finished a club-high 3rd and making it to an elimination final.
before. I'm hoping both of them get firing, and if we can do that again, I think we'll be an unstoppable team.
The Reds have further boosted their squad, bringing in 3 more international players, with one of them hoping to provide more attacking options.
I have a very strong kind of focus to go forward, and I think last year they struggled, I guess, kind of scoring some goals, and I hope I can kind of help them out with that and get some goals in the back of the net.
The team believe a strong off-season and hunger will hold the squad in good stead this season. Nethma Dandenia, ABC News.
Let's recap our top stories before we go. Several of Israel's allies condemn a move to ban UNRWA from its soil, with concerns for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians facing starvation. Thousands of protesters gather in the Georgian capital Tbilisi to demand the annulment of parliamentary elections, questioning the outcome. And people are warned to stay inside as smog engulfs parts of India and Pakistan, with concerns conditions could worsen with Diwali celebrations. And that is your world for tonight. You can always watch the show on iView, and more world news and interviews can be found at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Girish Sawlani. Be good to each other, and I'll see you soon.